So this is the SIG Auth intro. I am Okan. I'm one of the chairs of SIG Auth. This is Mike Danese. He's one of the other co-chairs. So there's a lot of people sort of involved in this. Tim is not here. He's the last remaining chair. If you guys hang out on the Kubernetes Slack channel, you will be very familiar with some of the sub-project approvers. Jordan is probably the most commonly seen individual in all of the Kubernetes Slack channels. But Clayton, David, as well as a lot of other individuals are very deeply involved. We do have a lot of sub-projects that have a very distinguished set of individuals that sort of carry on with them. So nothing is ever complete without our favorite XKCD slide. But as auth implies, it is slightly ambiguous. We do cover both authentication and authorization, but there's a larger set of domains within the Kubernetes ecosystem that we cover. Auditing falls under that category, as well as security policies such as PSPs. But what I think sometimes people miss from this is some of the larger sub-projects, such as like encryption at rest, still fall under us, as well as certificates. So the CSR API, node isolation, there's a sub-project on multi-tenancy now. All of those still fall very much under SIG Auth.
We're kind of the catch-all of security-related efforts that are not well suited for other parts of the project.
Yeah.
We kind of adopt those efforts.
Yeah. We don't officially handle CVEs. Right?
Yeah, so we don't actually handle responding to security incidents. There's a separate group called the product security team that does handle that, and we work closely with them. CVEs are handled through product security, and then they involve the SIG, that is the code owner, where the CVE needs to be fixed.
Yeah. So what have we been working on in the last year or so? So we're making slow progress towards taking a lot of APIs that have been in alpha or beta state for a very long time and trying to move them up to the beta and possibly GA category. So the CSR API has been beta for
like 3 years.
It's well baked now, we could say.
Yeah.
There's a handful of things. So we have been working towards triaging our issues on GitHub, so it's much easier to find sort of what the SIG is working on now.
Yeah, I think we collected a bunch of features over the past 3 years and kept collecting and collecting, and at this point, we should start to push to harden some of the features that a lot of people are depending on at this point, and make sure that they reach GA. So if we keep adding features, then none of them will ever go to GA. So that's our theme: stability and getting things to GA for 2019.
Yeah, I don't know if an API is really beta if everyone uses it in every production cluster.
So just doing the final push.
If you guys are familiar with service accounts, so traditionally they've been backed by secrets inside of etcd, but Mike and a lot of others have done an enormous amount of effort towards more ephemeral tokens. So the token request API, as well as the token projection volumes, are the push towards it's both a pod identity that can be observed outside of the cluster, but in general, it is a better security practice to have short-lived ephemeral tokens not stored in your main data store to be stolen by any.
I'll do the exec auth plugin. So the exec auth plugin is our plan for moving a lot of the client auth plugins out of the tree. So plugins like the GCP and Azure plugin are sitting in client Go right now. The exec auth plugin provides an API where kubeconfig clients, such as kubecontrol, will exec a binary, and that binary will output a token, and that token will be used against the API server. So as part of the code organization effort, we think it's a really important feature to get to GA so that we can start to move these plugins out of the tree. Can we do the third one too, or fourth one?
It's up to you.
All right, it's just me and Jordan worked on this one a little bit.
Yeah.
So we want node taints to be and labels to be used for dedicated nodes. However, due to really old permissions and a lot of legacy constraints, nodes have been able to delete themselves, delete their node object, which clears labels and taints, and recreate it. So I think starting in 1.10, we started to phase out some of this behavior. So first we had to make no code path in the kubelet, delete the node object, and then we had to wait 2 releases, and then we had to remove this permission behind the flag, and now we are trying to figure out how to constrain taints and labels. So this is actually like a this is probably an effort that I think is going to conclude in 1.17, but just because so much corrupt was built around this API and some insecure code paths exist, it took a lot of effort to phase out. But it's I think it's overall important for the general hardening effort to close that out so that we can use taints and labels for dedicated nodes and node isolation.
I mean, if we want to add to that, like, so if you configure your cluster today to use like the node authorizer, the node restriction plugin, you strip any RBAC-based access from the nodes, you get a pretty sound level of security. You can make, right? Like if your kubelets can kind of do anything, a kubelet compromise effectively is a cluster compromise, and that's what we want to avoid, right? Because they are running your workloads. They're much more vulnerable than something like your master that you might isolate in your environment. So some of the things that we are trying to push forward. So you can configure audit policies directly via like a file-based approach on masters today. Dynamic audit effectively brings that up into a REST-style API, like a Kubernetes-style API. What that gives you is the ability to say, okay, I have a running cluster. Something is wrong. I happen to know within some subpath that these resources are involved. I want to see what's going on there, right? And it just so happens in distributed systems, restarting a process is a great way to cause things to work again. It just happens to be the domain that we're in. So having the ability to tell the Kube API server, hey, I need you to start logging this stuff, but don't like reboot yourself, is extremely important. So we're working towards that. There is performance considerations as well as just like higher level policy considerations we're still looking through. Not necessarily all of it is required for beta or GA, but we do want to make sure that if you did turn this on, it didn't like just completely turn your cluster into an unusable state.
External service account signer. So this is a feature of the API server where the proposal is the API server will be able to reach out to a gRPC service listening on a Unix domain socket in order to sign service account tokens, and also to retrieve a set of public keys to verify service account tokens against. So the idea here is that in the past, in order to rotate the service account signing key, it would require restarting the API server. This is pretty painful if you are trying to maintain some level of API SLO, having to restart that if you have rotation once per day or once per week. That's a lot of unavailability. So I think this is going to add a bit more flexibility here. This is an effort being pushed on by AWS team, EKS team, and I think it'll also improve security in scenarios where potentially the keys could be held off of the actual API server VM. So maybe it would support keys in KMS or in TPM.
So on a little bit extension on that, so I think we're still trying to figure out what the shape and design of such an API looks like. So if like anyone has experience on a similar problem domain, it would be really nice if we didn't invent all of it from scratch ourselves. If we have to, that's perfectly fine. But yeah, it does fall into let's not restart things, let's keep things running all the time while maintaining a high security boundary.
Make it easier to do things that we want people to do, like rotate keys.
Yeah, I mean, we say rotate sort of as a, oh yeah, you should do that, and it's like, but it's so painful.
We don't make it easy.
Yeah.
I'll do just a quick snippet on. So group managed service accounts are a feature of Active Directory, I believe. They're going to be supported for Windows containers in beta in 1.16, and we were waiting on some of the fields that are currently annotations to be elevated into actual fields and API objects to make it easier to convert to an eventual GA API. We didn't want to send it to beta while still depending on annotation, because we've been bit by that in the past.
Yeah. Do you want to know? I have good. All right. That was totally you.
So this is also part of the overall hardening effort. There are a lot of things like the Calico node agent or the node problem detector, which are essentially node scoped system daemons, and they do need some access to write to the Kubernetes API. For example, Calico might need to write to pod statuses for pods running on the node, or the node problem detector might need to write to node status. So this is actually a solved problem for node identities. So the node authorizer and node restriction and mission controller will actually be constrain the kubelet so that it can only write to pods or PVs or service accounts that are reachable in the object graph. However, we don't have a solution that is general purpose that could be extended to Calico so that it had the same node scope. We think this is important, but it actually turns out to be a kind of a hard problem to solve generally. We're still brainstorming the KEP that was proposed. Had some. There wasn't general consensus that it was going to be a great idea. So right now, I think we're recommending that where it makes sense, run those components that as using the kubelet identity, and then we're going to try to figure out a better option moving forward.
Yeah. So onto the bound service account. So this is sort of the extension of the token request API, right? So you can mount an ephemeral service account token into a volume, and the kubelet will keep rewriting and re-refreshing that token on disk for you. So we know we want to eventually move basically everything to this approach, but as you can imagine, that will break a lot of apps that just read the token once on startup and didn't read it again. So we do have a backwards compatibility issue with this, but our own core components, ideally the kube controller manager or any piece of infra that is very Kubernetes aware, doesn't have that same restriction. So we've started so the controllers that run on the control plane, they all are backed by service account tokens. And traditionally, if, for example, you deleted those secrets that were backing those service account tokens, those controllers would just stop working. I've actually used this as a feature before to turn off controllers. It's not exactly the way to do it, but the idea would be, though, that these controllers have an enormous level of access on your control plane. Like if you look at the cluster role aggregation controller, it's just full root all the time. It always will be full root, and it is concerning when there is a secret living inside of etcd that if you gain access to, you will be root on the cluster till the end of time. The way we implemented this was effectively we check to see if your cluster is running with the token request API enabled. If so, we will optionally then provision those controllers with ephemeral tokens. The future looking bit on this is we would want the service account token controller to stop minting tokens for those service accounts altogether. And instead, those service accounts would be purely ephemeral all of the time.
So a note about the compatibility. We updated the client libraries back to 1.12 to do the reloading. There's a couple other things that are not going to work with these new tokens. Specifically, they don't support the downward API reference in environment variables. So with the old secret volume, you could put that secret into an environment variable, and the reason that we stopped supporting that is because it would get logged in very unfortunate places. And we also locked down the read file permissions for these secrets. Secrets, for whatever reason, are actually ACLed to be, I think, 644 by default. So these go to 640. So people using running containers as non-root might see some issues with that. So we have no plan, and we won't turn this on until we have a plan to roll this out. But we think it substantially increases the security of the cluster. You can turn it on yourself if you're willing to go fix things. But yeah, it's kind of unknown how we're going to be able to turn this on uniformly.
I have a feeling we will have a conversation with SIG architecture at some point in the not too distant future. Cool. So as we mentioned earlier, we've started doing a much better job of triaging our labels and just our issues in general. So we have been using sort of the extra time on at the end of our SIG meetings to give priority to various things and just try to make sure that things that are new and open get a response, as well as there's a lot of things that are very nice to have, but we know that we don't have cycles to get to them, so maybe put those in our backlog, whereas other things we're like, well, we really should do this. It's sort of a critical bit of security infrastructure. Certainly at any level, if an individual wanted to get involved, we would not stop you in any way. I was the one who had made the issue for hey, we should make the controller manager use token requests, but I never got to it, but a contributor did, and Mike and Jordan reviewed his stuff and it got merged. So it took a while, but I was happy. I had expected to do it myself, but I didn't get to it, so it worked out.
Yeah, and it's always good to contribute in the direction of those 2019 goals, which is to stabilize things. So right now we are going to be much faster on reviewing bug fixes and stability improvements than we will be for new features, because we want to stabilize the platform right now.
Yeah. And I will say writing tests and just reading code is enormously valuable if you're unfamiliar with a certain area of the code base. So here's all the places you can find us. Certainly the bi-weekly meetings are the highest bandwidth. Don't be shy. We don't mind if you put something in our agenda. We're very
appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'm always kind of sad if there's nothing on the agenda. All right, meeting canceled. There's nobody here. But yeah, I mean, even if it's something as simple as, hey, I did a cool little demo app and I wanted to.
11 Pacific time. Sorry, the time zone. Is that right? 11 Pacific time? Is that what
I copied it from the old slide. Did it change?
So what is that in Central European time?
I don't know.
All right. Yeah, so you'll have to adjust.
Yes, it is 2 o'clock for me, 11 o'clock for California folks. I'm not sure what it is in European time.
It's 8 o'clock. 8 p.m. Yeah. Join us.
Oh yeah, that's right. I told you not to be on those meetings because it was too late. You should. Quick little blurb. So Mike has a talk later today on some cool stuff with the token request API in Istio. You should totally check it out. Matt and I tomorrow have the deep dive on SIG Auth, where It's a very sort of code-heavy talk. We're going to be going through how like the auth stack sort of works. If you're interested in becoming a contributor to that area of the code, certainly I'm hoping it's helpful. And with that, the floor is yours, guys.
Yeah, is there any questions you wanted to ask or discussion topics?
Well, I'm very interested in the bound service token feature. So I'm very interested in the bound service tokens feature because we are migrating a lot of workloads now to Kubernetes, and in the first case, most of the time we piggyback on the identity of the service account of the pod, and that's why I'm interested in how to turn it on when it's like, I understand it's very like alpha or beta quality right now, and it's not like maybe fully integrated, but what's the idea, what's the plan to move forward?
Yeah, so if you are running 112 cluster or later, the actual volume and the API will be available if you don't turn off beta features, because beta features will be on by default. There is a separate feature which replaces the core, the volume that we put in every pod, which is currently alpha. That's one that's going to be hard to turn on. I think the name of the feature gate is bound service account token, and then you would set that as a feature flag on the API server, and that would make the service account admission controller use the new style service account volumes.
Yeah, like some of the gotchas on that is that volume to PSP doesn't look the same as like the old volume, so it can just start rejecting your pods.
Right. So it's a bit fragile, but we would love for people to try it out. And you can turn only that alpha feature on, and I would say that it's not alpha because it's unstable. It's alpha because it's going to be hard to turn on. But those features have been around since 111 and 112. So by now they've actually had a little runway, but we could do a better job at explaining or documenting how to turn just that feature on. Maybe I can find the issue.
So I can use it on a managed Kubernetes for a public cloud provider with 1.13 or 14, like the low level, more or less do-it-yourself thing, and if I'm looking for like the full solution, that is still a couple of months. If I take like 1.12 is now, or 13 is recent at Google or AWS, then it will be like probably a few months still away.
Yeah,
to use that in a managed offering.
So GKE has it turned on right now in 112 clusters. EKS I think is waiting to turn it on, but I do believe that they have plans to turn it on. Yeah, I think it depends on what you're using the tokens for. So are you using them to talk to the API server, or are you using them?
A variety of use cases, but most of the time also talking to other systems. It's not only the API server.
Yeah. That makes it a little bit easier because the features that you would depend on for service to service are already beta. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
A related piece to that is there's a cap out for like being able to consume like the public key of like what's being actually used to sign the service account tokens, which is useful for some form of like external stores, right? Like if you have some external system that wants to consume a service account token, it needs to be able to like be like, what do I check? What's the public key for this? And the idea would be is somehow the Kube API server would tell you that, hey, these are the public keys I'm currently using. So if you see a service account token, verify against one of these keys.
In the meantime, you can also use the token review API.
Yeah, that's what we're using, but it would be nice to have, I think Google has a kind of private endpoint or alpha endpoint for get JWKS, but it would be very nice to have this as a Kubernetes API.
Yeah.
So I found the issue already.
Right. We should just do it.
Yeah, I think we're more or less committed to it. I don't think we have a way out.
Yeah, let's do it in 1:15 or 16.
Yeah.
Cool. We'll add a note to an issue and upload the slides to point you in the right direction after the talk. Anything else anybody wanted to talk about? Dynamic audit?
116.
Right. Yep.
Slow and steady.
Slow and steady.
Yeah, that one is going to be hard. But yeah, I very much understand the desire. Messing with files on disk and then restarting Kube API servers is not awesome.
Cool. Well, if that's everybody, thank you all for attending. And we hope to see you at our meetings and in our Slack channel. And at the deep dive and at my talk.
Right, thanks, guys.